The Unwanted Dog Who Disappeared and What Happened Next. Scene 1. The Past and the Abandonment. The night was thick with rain, a relentless downpour hammering against the asphalt. Headlights cut through the darkness, their beams glinting off the slick pavement as a lone truck sped down an empty road. The vehicle swerved slightly before slowing, pulling over near the edge of the highway where a dense forest loomed beyond the shoulder. Inside the truck, a pair of shaking brown eyes darted between the driver and the window. The creature's breath fogged up the glass as it whimpered softly, sensing something was terribly wrong. The driver hesitated, his knuckles whitened against the steering wheel as he stole a final glance into the rearview mirror. The rain pounded harder, drowning out all sound except the muffled breathing of the animal in the back seat. Then, with a sharp inhale, he reached across the seat, opened the door, and muttered under his breath, "Sorry, boy, I can't keep you." Lightning slashed across the sky. The dog, a Belgian Malinois mix, lean and strong despite the ribs faintly visible beneath his short fur, flinched as the man grabbed his collar and dragged him out. His paws skidded against the wet ground, scrambling for balance as the man pulled harder. The dog didn't fight, he didn't growl, he just looked up at the only human he had ever known, his ears flicking back in confusion. The man's hand trembled, but only for a second. Then, with a final yank, he unlatched the worn leather collar from the dog's neck and tossed it into the truck. The dog took a hesitant step forward, trying to follow. The door slammed shut. A deep rumble filled the night as the engine roared back to life. The truck lurched forward, tires spitting mud as it pulled away, taillights fading into the rain-soaked abyss. The dog stood motionless, his fur drenched, his body shivering from the cold. His ears pricked at the sound of the engine retreating, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He took a step forward, then another, before breaking into a full sprint. He ran. His paws pounded against the wet pavement, splashing through puddles as he chased the only family he had ever known. His breath came in ragged gasps, his muscles burning with effort. The truck was getting farther, its lights growing dim. Then, as if the universe itself had sealed his fate, a deafening crack of thunder split the sky. The dog skidded to a halt, his legs buckling as fear overtook him. By the time he lifted his head again, the truck was gone. A desperate whimper left his throat. He stood there, panting, waiting, hoping that the man would turn around, that this was some kind of mistake. But the road remained empty, and just like that, he was alone. The shelter. The smell of antiseptic and wet fur hung heavy in the air. Rows of metal kennels stretched down the concrete hallway, each one filled with restless bodies, whining, barking, pacing. But in the farthest corner, where the dim fluorescent light barely reached, lay a silent figure. The same brown-eyed dog, now nothing more than a shadow of his former self. His coat had lost its sheen, dulled by weeks of exposure to the shelter's sterile environment. His ribs were more pronounced now, his body thinner, weaker. He barely moved except to shift slightly on the cold concrete floor, his tail curled tightly around his body. He had long since stopped barking. At first, when he had been brought in, soaked, shaking, and terrified, he had waited for the familiar sound of his owner's voice, the jingle of keys, the scent of home. Days passed, then weeks, no one came. He watched as other dogs left, puppies, bright-eyed and hopeful, wagging their tails as they were lifted into the arms of smiling families. He had once wagged his tail too, had once pressed his nose against the metal bars, ears perked in anticipation, hopeful that today would be the day. But it never was. Over time, the excitement in his eyes dimmed. The eager glances he had once thrown toward passing visitors faded into indifference. He learned. No one wanted a dog like him, too old to be a puppy, too quiet to be noticed, too broken to be chosen. The shelter workers had given him a name, Whisper. A cruel irony, really, considering how silent he had become. "He's been here too long," one of the volunteers murmured, glancing toward his kennel. Dogs like him, they don't last. Another worker sighed, checking the clipboard. A few more weeks, maybe. If no one adopts him. Her voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Whisper didn't react. He had heard those words before, and deep inside, some part of him had already accepted it. The final blow, one evening, long after the barking had died down and the shelter was cloaked in stillness, Whisper let himself remember. He closed his eyes, his ears twitching as ghosts of the past drifted into his mind. A backyard, bathed in golden sunlight, laughter, his owner's laughter, a ball soaring through the air, his legs propelling him forward as he leaped, caught it mid-air, the warmth of a hand scratching behind his ears, the familiar scent of home. But the memories were cruel. They didn't comfort him. They only reminded him of everything he had lost. A heavy sigh escaped his lips as he shifted against the floor, pressing himself deeper into the shadows of his kennel. His body ached, not from hunger or exhaustion, but from something far worse. Hopelessness, a change in the air. The next morning was like any other. Dogs barked, tails wagged, adoption papers were signed. One by one, kennels emptied, but not his. He didn't even bother lifting his head anymore. Then something strange happened. A pair of footsteps stopped outside his kennel, not the hurried shuffle of workers or the excited squeals of children. These footsteps were different, steady, heavy. A shadow fell over his kennel. He felt it rather than saw it. The presence of someone standing there, unmoving, watching. Slowly he cracked open an eye. A man stood before him, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in worn jeans and a faded jacket. His expression unreadable, but his eyes, deep, tired eyes, held something unexpected. Recognition. Whisper blinked, unsure. The man said nothing, just kept staring at him, as if he understood. Then, after a long moment, he turned to the shelter worker.
"I want this one."
Whisper's ears flicked slightly.
Had he heard that right?
The worker hesitated. "He's not the easiest dog. He doesn't—"
"I don't need easy," the man interrupted. "I need him."
For the first time in what felt like forever, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirred inside Whisper's chest, something he had long forgotten.
Hope.
Scene 2. The fateful meeting. The shelter was noisy. It always was. The echo of barking dogs bounced off the metal walls, a constant, chaotic symphony of desperation. Some barked excitedly, tails wagging against the bars of their cages, eager to be noticed. Others howled, a lonely, haunting cry that faded into the overwhelming chorus. But Whisper remained silent. He lay in the farthest corner of his kennel, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half-lidded in exhaustion. The world outside his metal prison blurred into a meaningless haze. It didn't matter anymore. People came and went, their faces lighting up as they found their perfect puppy, the playful, tail-wagging, bright-eyed ones. Not him, never him. And so he didn't lift his head when the next visitor entered the shelter. A man without a home. Jack Dawson had never intended to come here. The idea had been suggested by his therapist, some well-meaning woman who thought a dog might help. Companionship, she had called it. Something to ground you. He had resisted at first. What did he know about taking care of another living thing? He could barely take care of himself. His nights were plagued by memories he couldn't erase, ghosts of a past he couldn't outrun. But today, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he found himself standing inside the shelter, watching as hopeful dogs pressed themselves against the bars, their eyes pleading for a chance. Jack shoved his hands into his pockets, scanning the rows of cages. Too young, too energetic, too demanding. None of them felt right. Then, almost by accident, his eyes drifted to the far end of the room, to the darkest corner where a lone figure lay motionless. Unlike the others, this one didn't move, didn't bark, didn't even look up. Jack frowned. Something about that stillness unsettled him. He took a step closer. The closer he got, the more details he noticed. The dull coat, the way the ribs pressed faintly against the skin, the unmoving tail curled tightly around a frail body. But it was the eyes that stopped him in his tracks. Deep, brown, and hollow, they barely acknowledged his presence. Not fearful, not hopeful.
Just empty.
Jack knew that look. He saw it every morning in the mirror. A wordless understanding. The shelter worker approached from behind. "That's Whisper," she said softly, as if afraid to disturb him. Jack's brow furrowed. "Whisper?" She gave a sad smile. "He doesn't make a sound. Hasn't barked in months. He's been here longer than most." Jack turned back to the dog. Whisper hadn't moved. He was just lying there, staring past him as if he weren't even real. "How long?" Jack asked. The worker hesitated. "Over a year." Jack exhaled slowly.
A year.
12 months of cold concrete floors, metal bars, and the same routine day after day. Watching other dogs leave, knowing he never would. Jack's jaw clenched. He had spent years in war zones, counting down the days until he could go home, until he realized he didn't have one anymore. Maybe this dog knew what that felt like. Maybe he understood. Without thinking, Jack crouched down. He didn't speak.
Didn't reach out.
He just sat there, at Whisper's level, waiting. Seconds stretched into minutes. The shelter worker shifted uncomfortably. And then, so slight it was almost imperceptible, Whisper's eyes flickered. Not much, not enough to be called curiosity.
But enough.
A spark. A whisper of something long buried beneath the weight of loneliness. Jack's lips pressed into a thin line. "I want him," he said. The shelter worker blinked. "Are you sure? He's not the easiest dog. He doesn't play. He doesn't—" "I don't need easy," Jack interrupted, his voice firm. "I need him." Whisper's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Jack saw it then, how fragile this moment was. How, with the wrong movement, the wrong tone, the wrong expectation, it could all shatter. So he didn't push, didn't coax, didn't demand. He just waited. A choice made in silence. The shelter worker sighed. "All right," she said finally. "Let me get the paperwork." Jack stood, rolling his shoulders. He wasn't sure what had just happened, if anything had happened at all, but his gut told him not to question it. Minutes later, the worker returned, clipboard in hand. Jack signed where she pointed, barely glancing at the forms. Adoption, ownership, responsibility, words that had meant nothing to him for years. Now they meant something else, a second chance. When the paperwork was done, the worker nodded toward Whisper's kennel. "Are you ready?" Jack hesitated. Ready? No, he wasn't sure he had ever been ready for anything in his life. But he was here, and so was Whisper. The latch clicked. Jack held his breath. For the first time in over a year, Whisper's door swung open. The dog didn't move, didn't react. He just stared at the open space in front of him, as if he couldn't quite believe it was real. Jack didn't rush him. He simply crouched again, resting his forearms on his knees, and spoke, softly, steadily.
"You coming, boy?"
Whisper's ears flicked. For the first time, he lifted his head. Jack felt something tighten in his chest. Then cautiously Whisper moved. Not a leap, not a sprint. Just one step.
Then another.
Each one slow, tentative. And then finally Whisper crossed the threshold. Jack reached out, slow, deliberate, but stopped short, leaving space between them. Whisper hesitated, his nose twitching, nostrils flaring as he took in the unfamiliar scent. For a brief, fleeting second their eyes met. Man and dog, two souls lost in the same darkness.
And in that moment something shifted.
Something unspoken passed between them. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Yeah," he murmured, "we'll figure it out." With that, he stood and took the leash. For the first time in a long time, Whisper walked beside someone without being forced. For the first time in a long time, he stepped out of his cage towards something unknown, something terrifying, something that might, just maybe, be called home. Scene 3. The journey home and first barriers. The first step into the unknown. The moment the shelter doors closed behind them, Whisper hesitated. His paws hovered just above the concrete step, his body frozen in place as if an invisible barrier kept him from moving forward. The parking lot stretched out before him, wet from the earlier rain, the dull hum of passing cars filling the air. Jack stood beside him, one hand holding the leash loosely, the other resting in his jacket pocket. He didn't pull, didn't coax. Instead, he waited. He had seen that look before, the quiet terror of someone stepping into the unknown. He had felt it himself, in 1,000 different ways. "Take your time, boy," Jack murmured. Whisper's ears flicked, but he didn't move. His eyes darted around, scanning for an escape. His muscles coiled like springs ready to launch him into a desperate sprint. Jack exhaled softly. This was the first test. If he pulled, if he forced it, the fragile thread of trust between them would snap. So he crouched, keeping his posture loose, his voice steady. "It's just a step, buddy, that's all." Whisper's nostrils flared. He lowered his head, sniffing at the damp ground, his breath quick and shallow. Then, ever so slowly, he lifted one paw and set it down on the pavement. Jack didn't react. Another step, then another. By the time Whisper reached the truck, his body was tense, every muscle trembling. Jack opened the passenger door, gesturing toward the seat. "Up you go." Whisper didn't move. Jack sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "All right," he muttered. "Guess we're doing this the hard way." Moving carefully, he knelt beside Whisper and looped an arm under his chest. The second he made contact, Whisper flinched violently, a sharp, reflexive recoil that sent his claws scraping against the pavement. Jack froze. For the first time, he saw it clearly. Not just fear, but the deep, ingrained instinct of a creature who had learned that human hands could bring pain. His stomach twisted. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "I won't hurt you." Whisper's breath came in quick, uneven pants, his eyes locked on Jack's hands. Slowly, carefully, Jack backed off and sat down on the curb. They stayed like that for a long time. The shelter lights flickered behind them. The sky darkened. Cars passed by in the distance. And then, after what felt like an eternity, Whisper moved. Not much, just an inch, just enough to lower his head and sniff the open truck door. Jack waited. Finally, as if making a choice he barely understood himself, Whisper lifted a paw, placed it inside the truck, and hesitated. Jack held his breath. Then, in one fluid motion, Whisper leapt onto the seat, curled into the smallest shape possible, and pressed himself against the farthest corner. Jack exhaled, stepping back. "Good boy," he murmured. He shut the door gently and walked around to the driver's side. For the first time in what felt like years, Whisper was leaving the shelter behind. But neither of them knew if he was truly free yet. A silent ride. The truck's engine rumbled to life and Whisper flinched. Jack kept his gaze forward, resisting the urge to check on him. He knew better. If Whisper caught him staring, he might take it as a threat. The road stretched ahead, a winding ribbon of asphalt cutting through the outskirts of town. Rain began to fall again, a light drizzle tapping against the windshield. In the passenger seat, Whisper barely moved. He was curled so tightly that he looked smaller than he was, his ribs rising and falling in shallow, rhythmic breaths. His eyes flicked toward the window, watching the world blur past. Jack had seen that expression before, the look of someone who had been in a car once before, who had been driven somewhere and left behind. Jack tightened his grip on the wheel. He knew that memory too well. The last time Whisper had been in a car, it had ended in abandonment. The last time Jack had been in a car, it had ended in war. Two souls, haunted by different roads, now traveling the same one. Jack cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You ever been to a good home, boy?" No response. Didn't matter, he wasn't expecting one. "Well," Jack muttered, shifting gears, "guess we'll find out together." Whisper blinked, his ears twitching at the sound of Jack's voice. For a brief moment, his tail twitched, just once, barely a movement at all. But Jack saw it, and for the first time that night, he allowed himself to hope. Arrival, by the time they reached Jack's house, the rain had stopped, leaving the ground damp and the air thick with the scent of wet earth. Jack pulled into the driveway and killed the engine. Silence. The house loomed ahead, small and unassuming, tucked at the edge of a quiet street lined with trees. A porch light flickered above the front steps, casting a warm glow against the night. Jack turned to Whisper. "All right, boy, we're here." Whisper didn't move. Jack sighed, pushing open his door and stepping out. The cool night air wrapped around him as he walked to the other side of the truck and opened the passenger door. Whisper shrank back. Jack crouched. "Hey," he said gently, "I'm not going to carry you, all right? But you got to move." Whisper's ears flattened. His eyes darted between Jack and the open space beyond the truck. Then, after a long hesitation, he inched forward. One paw touched the truck's edge, then another. Jack stepped back. Whisper hesitated a second longer before finally leaping down, landing with a soft thud on the damp driveway. Jack straightened, giving him space. Whisper's nose twitched, inhaling the new scents. The fresh grass, the wood of the porch, the faintest hint of something warm lingering in the air. He took one cautious step forward, then another. Jack didn't move, didn't rush him. When Whisper reached the base of the porch steps, he stopped again. Jack exhaled. "It's just a door, buddy." But Whisper didn't see a door. He saw another threshold, another moment where a choice had to be made. To enter meant risking everything. To stay meant nothing would change. Jack took a step forward, placing his hand on the doorknob. "It's up to you," he said quietly. "But whatever you decide, I won't leave you behind." The words hung between them, heavy and real. Whisper swallowed. Then, with a breath so soft it could have been the wind, he moved. One paw, then another. And finally, for the first time in a long, long time, Whisper stepped inside. Jack closed the door behind them. The house was quiet, filled with the faint scent of old wood and coffee. Whisper stood frozen in the entryway, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar space. Jack shrugged off his jacket, tossing it onto a chair. "Welcome home," he murmured. Whisper said nothing. But as Jack turned toward the kitchen, he caught something out of the corner of his eye. A small, almost imperceptible movement. Whisper's tail, twitching just slightly. A beginning. A whisper of something new. Jack smiled. They'd figure it out. Together. Scene 4. The first signs of trust.
A house that wasn't a home yet. The silence inside the house felt different.
Not the empty, hollow kind that Whisper had grown used to in the shelter, nor the suffocating stillness of that night on the road when he had watched his only home disappear.
This was another kind of silence.
A waiting silence. Jack closed the door behind them, locking out the outside world. He exhaled, shaking the rain from his jacket before hanging it on a hook near the entrance. Whisper stood frozen in place. His paws barely touched the worn wooden floor, his body stiff, his ears flicking at every tiny sound, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of settling walls, the distant whistle of wind slipping through the trees outside. Jack gave him space. He moved through the house with easy familiarity, not looking at Whisper, not expecting anything. If there was one thing he had learned, it was that forcing someone, human or dog, to feel safe never worked. You had to let them decide for themselves. Jack poured himself a cup of coffee, the dark liquid steaming as he leaned against the kitchen counter. From the corner of his eye, he watched Whisper. The dog hadn't moved from the threshold. He stood like a statue, his tail tucked low, his head slightly bowed, not quite fear, but not quite comfort either. Jack took a sip of his coffee and let the moment stretch. Finally, without turning his head, he spoke. "You can come in, you know." Whisper's ears flicked. Jack took another slow sip. "Or don't. Up to you." A long pause. Then, so slight it was barely noticeable, Whisper shifted just a single step forward, his nails clicking softly against the wood. Jack didn't react. Another step, then another. By the time Whisper reached the center of the room, Jack was almost afraid to move. Instead, he set his cup down and casually walked past him, heading toward the hallway. "Gonna get some sleep," he murmured. "You do whatever you need to." With that, he disappeared down the hall. Whisper was alone. But this time, the emptiness didn't feel quite as lonely. The first night, Jack wasn't a heavy sleeper. Years in the military had trained him otherwise, his body always alert, his mind half awake, even in the deepest hours of the night. Which was why, at some point, past midnight, he heard it. The soft shuffle of paws against the floor. His eyes cracked open, adjusting to the dim glow of the moonlight filtering through the window. He didn't move, just listened. The sound was slow, hesitant. Then silence. Jack exhaled softly. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see the dark shape standing near the doorway. Whisper. The dog was barely visible, his outline a shadow against the faint light. He wasn't inside the room, not completely, just standing there, watching. Jack stayed still, unsure if moving would startle him. After a long, silent minute, Whisper took a single step backward, then another, and just like that, he was gone. Jack lay awake for a long time after that. Shadows of the past. The days that followed were slow. Whisper never ventured far from the walls, keeping himself to the edges of rooms, always watching, never participating. Jack let him be. He worked around the house, repairing a leaky faucet in the kitchen, fixing the loose board on the porch. Every so often he would catch Whisper staring. The dog would quickly avert his gaze, slinking back into the shadows. But something was changing. Whisper had stopped flinching when Jack moved. He no longer scrambled away when the front door opened. He still wouldn't come near, still wouldn't take food from Jack's hand, but he was beginning to exist in the same space without fear. That was something. One afternoon, Jack sat on the worn leather couch in the living room, a book in his hands, a cup of coffee resting on the table beside him. He read without paying much attention, his thoughts elsewhere. Then, movement. A flicker of motion near the edge of his vision. Slowly, carefully, Jack lowered the book. Whisper had moved. Not far, just a little closer. His paws were now a foot away from the couch, his body low, ears pinned back slightly in uncertainty. Jack didn't breathe. Seconds stretched into minutes. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, Whisper shifted backward, returning to his usual distance. Jack swallowed. He wanted to say something, wanted to acknowledge the moment, encourage it, reward it. But he knew better. So he simply lifted his book again and kept reading, as if nothing had happened. A storm on the horizon. That night the storm rolled in. The first crack of thunder shattered the quiet, rattling the windows and sending a low vibration through the walls. Jack woke instantly. The room was dark, the air thick with the electric charge of the storm outside. Rain lashed against the roof, wind howling through the trees.
Then another sound.
A whimper. Jack pushed himself upright, his senses sharpening. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room for a split second. Whisper was curled into the tightest ball imaginable, pressed into the farthest corner of the room, his body trembling violently. Jack exhaled, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. He moved slow, careful. "Hey," he said softly. It's okay, boy." Whisper flinched, his head snapped up, his eyes wild, darting between Jack and the door as if debating whether to run. Jack stayed where he was, lowering his voice to something steady, something calm. "You're safe. Just a storm, that's all." Another boom of thunder rocked the house. Whisper's body went rigid, his breath coming in quick, uneven pants. Jack hesitated, then made a decision. He slid off the bed and sat on the floor, keeping a good few feet of distance between them. "I don't like storms either," he admitted. "Never did. Too loud." Whisper didn't move, but his ears flicked slightly, just enough to tell Jack he was listening. Jack stretched out his legs, leaning back on his hands. "You don't have to come closer," he said, but I'm staying right here." Minutes passed, the storm raged on. And then, slowly, hesitantly, Whisper moved. Not all the way, not close enough to touch, but close enough that, for the first time, Jack could hear his breathing steady. And as the storm outside finally began to fade, so did the storm inside Whisper's eyes. Scene 5. The breaking point. A morning like any other. The sky was the color of pale steel, the crisp morning air carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Jack stood by the porch, stretching his arms as he sipped his coffee, watching the way the trees swayed in the light breeze. Inside, Whisper lay near the couch, curled in his usual spot. His eyes weren't closed, but neither were they fully open. He existed in that quiet, liminal space, somewhere between alert and at rest. Jack had grown used to this. It had been weeks now, and though Whisper had made progress, eating when Jack was in the room, moving more freely through the house. There were still barriers that hadn't been crossed. Whisper never sought touch, never wagged his tail, and he never ever let Jack close enough to put a leash on him. Jack sighed, leaning against the porch railing. He had been patient, but even patience had limits. "All right, boy," he called into the house. "We're trying something new today." Whisper's ears twitched, his head lifting slightly. Jack stepped inside, setting his mug down on the counter before reaching for the leash hanging near the door. It was simple, just a sturdy black lead with a metal clasp, but the second he picked it up, Whisper stiffened. The change was instant. Muscles tensed, eyes sharpened, his body coiled, ready to run. Jack paused.
"Easy," he murmured.
Whisper's gaze locked onto the leash as if it were a weapon. His breaths came quicker, his tail curling inward, his nails digging slightly into the floor. Jack knew this reaction. Someone, somewhere, had taught Whisper to fear the leash. Jack exhaled slowly. He didn't move any closer. Instead, he crouched down and set the leash on the floor between them.
"It's not going to hurt you," he said.
Whisper's nose twitched, but he stayed rigid. Jack reached for a treat from his pocket and placed it beside the leash. A test, a choice. For a long moment, Whisper didn't move. His body was a statue, frozen in the space between flight and fight. Then hesitantly he took one step forward. Jack didn't breathe. Whisper's eyes flicked between the leash and the treat, his ears pinned back. His front paw inched closer. Jack's heart pounded. And then, just as Whisper was about to take the treat, something shattered the moment. A sudden sharp bang echoed from outside. Fireworks. A single piercing explosion split the air. Jack flinched, his instincts screaming. But Whisper broke. The escape. The reaction was pure instinct. A burst of motion, a blur of fur. Whisper recoiled so fast that he crashed into the table behind him, sending a coffee cup flying. The shattering porcelain barely registered over the sound of Jack's voice. "Whisper, hey, it's okay." But Whisper wasn't listening. He was gone. His body slammed against the back door, claws scrabbling against the wood as he fought for escape. Jack lunged forward, but it was too late. The door gave way. And then Whisper was outside, sprinting into the open air like a creature being chased by ghosts. Jack cursed, grabbing the leash and bolting after him. The morning air was cold against his skin, but he barely felt it. His boots pounded against the earth as he ran, his eyes locked onto the dark shape, cutting through the trees ahead.
"Whisper!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Stop!"
But Whisper didn't stop. He ran like the past itself was hunting him. Jack pushed harder, his lungs burning. The ground was uneven, tree roots rising from the soil like traps waiting to catch him. He had been fast once. Back in the military, his body had been a machine, finely tuned, built for endurance.
But he wasn't that man anymore.
And Whisper was faster. The dog darted through the trees, weaving like a shadow, his lean muscles carrying him with effortless speed. Jack felt his balance shift, his boot caught on something. And then he was falling. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs, the world spinning as he hit the ground hard. For a second, everything blurred. By the time he pushed himself up, Whisper was gone. A desperate search. The world around him felt too quiet. The only sound was his own ragged breathing, the distant rustle of wind through the trees. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow, pushing to his feet. His body ached, but he didn't care. He had to find him. Panic clawed at his ribs, something deep and raw and terrifying. He couldn't lose him.
Not like this.
Jack moved, scanning the forest, his mind racing. Whisper had no collar, no ID, no reason to come back. If he got too far, he might never find him again. And Jack knew what happened to lost dogs.
They didn't always get found.
Jack ran. He searched for hours, calling Whisper's name until his throat was raw. Nothing. The sky darkened, the wind picked up, the cold seeped through his jacket, chilling him to the bone. Still he searched. But by the time night fell, Jack had to face the truth. Whisper was gone. The weight of failure. Jack sat on the porch, his head in his hands. The night was bitter, the stars distant and uncaring. He had failed. He had thought he was patient enough, careful enough. But it hadn't been enough. Jack clenched his fists. He had promised. He had promised Whisper that he wouldn't be abandoned again.
But now,
Now Whisper was alone in the dark, lost in a world that had never been kind to him. Jack's jaw tightened.
no, not yet.
Not until he had done everything. He pushed himself up, moving inside with renewed determination. He grabbed his flashlight, his coat, and the only thing he had left of Whisper, the leash he had never gotten the chance to use. Then he stepped back into the night. He wasn't giving up. Not now.
Not ever.
A glimmer of hope. Jack drove, slowly, methodically, scanning the empty streets, the quiet fields, the edges of the forest. He stopped at every alley, every abandoned lot, calling Whisper's name into the night. And then, just as exhaustion threatened to take hold, something caught his eye. A shadow, small, unmoving.
Near the edge of an old gas station.
Jack's breath hitched. He pulled over, his headlights cutting through the darkness. It was Whisper. The dog was curled tightly against the wall, his body pressed into the cold concrete, his eyes dull and distant. Jack swallowed hard, stepping out of the truck. He moved slow, his heart hammering. Whisper's ears flicked, but he didn't lift his head. Jack knelt.
"Hey, boy," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper.
Nothing. Jack's chest ached. Then slowly he reached into his pocket, pulled out the leash, laid it on the ground. "I'm not taking you back to the shelter," he said. I swear to you, I'm taking you home." A long, painful silence stretched between them.
Then,
Whisper blinked. His gaze flicked to the leash, then to Jack.
and finally he moved.
Not much, just enough to rest his head on the worn leather strap. Jack's throat tightened. He reached out, his fingers brushing softly against Whisper's fur. This time, Whisper didn't pull away. This time he stayed. And for the first time since he had run, since the past had chased him into the dark, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't lost anymore. He was found. Scene 6. Finally home. The ride back. The truck rumbled down the dark road, its headlights cutting through the misty night air. Inside, the cab was quiet, except for the soft, rhythmic breathing of the dog curled up in the passenger seat. Jack kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting lightly on his knee. He didn't reach out, didn't try to touch Whisper. Not yet. The dog lay curled tightly, his head resting near the door, his body still tense despite his exhaustion. The events of the past few hours still lingered in his mind. Jack could see it in the way Whisper's ears twitched at every sudden noise, in the way his paws occasionally jerked, as if he was still running. Jack exhaled.
"You scared the hell out of me, you know that?"
Whisper didn't move. Jack's fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "I get it," he murmured. "I know what it's like to run." For a long moment there was only silence. Then, so faint that Jack almost missed it, Whisper let out a deep sigh. Not one of fear, not one of pain.
But something softer, something like relief.
Jack's chest ached. He turned his attention back to the road. "We're almost home, buddy." Crossing the threshold. For real this time. The house was quiet when they arrived. The porch light flickered dimly, casting long shadows across the yard. Jack shut off the engine and turned toward Whisper. The dog hadn't moved, his body curled in the same tight position. His amber eyes were open but distant, his mind somewhere else. Jack opened his door and stepped out into the cool night air. He didn't call Whisper, didn't coax him. He just walked around the truck and opened the passenger door. Whisper didn't react. Jack crouched, his voice calm. "You ready, boy?" Whisper's ears flicked. Jack held his breath.
Then, slowly, hesitantly, Whisper lifted his head.
For a moment he just looked at Jack. Then, carefully, he stepped down from the truck. Jack stepped back, giving him space. Whisper stood still for a long moment, sniffing the damp earth beneath his paws. The scent of home, his home, wrapped around him. The smell of pine, of fresh grass, of something warm lingering in the air. Jack turned toward the house and walked to the porch. He unlocked the door, pushing it open. The house was waiting. Jack looked back. Whisper stood at the edge of the porch, just like the first night he had arrived. His body was still, his eyes wary. The threshold had been his prison once before. Jack's voice was soft. "It's your choice, Whisper, but I'm not leaving you behind." A moment stretched between them. Then Whisper moved. Not quickly, not eagerly,
but with purpose.
He stepped over the threshold, into the house, into the warmth. Jack let out a slow breath and closed the door behind them. For the first time, Whisper was home, breaking barriers. The first few days after Whisper's return were different. He still moved with caution, still kept his distance, but something had changed. The house wasn't just a strange place anymore. It was his place. Jack noticed the little things first. Whisper started eating while Jack was in the room, no longer waiting until he was alone. He stopped shrinking away when Jack moved too quickly, stopped flinching when the door opened. And one morning, when Jack was fixing coffee, he turned to find Whisper standing closer than ever before, only a few feet away, watching. Jack didn't move, didn't speak. He just waited. And after a long pause, Whisper inched forward. Jack held his breath. Whisper's nose twitched. Then in one hesitant movement, he lowered his head and brushed it, just briefly, against Jack's knee. Jack swallowed hard. It wasn't much.
But it was everything.
Freedom. A few weeks later, Jack decided it was time. The park was quiet, the sky a brilliant blue overhead. The scent of freshly cut grass lingered in the air, mingling with the crispness of autumn. Jack knelt beside Whisper, his fingers lightly resting on the leash clipped to his collar.
"You don't have to do this," Jack murmured.
Whisper's ears twitched. His muscles were tense, his body coiled as if waiting for something to go wrong. Jack understood. The last time he had been off-leash, he had run.
But this time
was different. Jack exhaled, then, slowly, he unclipped the leash. Whisper hesitated. Then, something changed. A flicker of memory, a buried instinct. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of open fields, of space, of freedom. Whisper bolted. Jack's breath caught, but not in fear, not in panic, because this time Whisper wasn't running away. He was running for the joy of it. His muscles stretched, his paws pounded against the earth, his tail lifted high behind him. Jack watched, his chest tight. Then something even more incredible happened. Whisper turned. His body twisted mid-stride, his paws kicking up dirt as he pivoted, and ran straight toward Jack. Jack barely had time to react before Whisper skidded to a stop in front of him, panting hard, his amber eyes gleaming. Jack let out a breathless chuckle. "You had me worried for a second there, boy." Whisper's tail twitched. Then, slowly, carefully, he stepped forward and pressed his head against Jack's chest. Jack swallowed. His fingers curled into Whisper's fur, his throat tight. He closed his eyes.
"Yeah," he whispered, "we're home now."
And for the first time in a long, long time, Whisper believed it. Epilogue, a life worth saving. Seasons changed. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. And Whisper changed with them. He no longer cowered near walls, no longer flinched at every sound. He learned the routines of the house, the quiet mornings when Jack sipped coffee by the window, the evenings when they sat by the fireplace. He learned that when the doorbell rang, he didn't need to be afraid. That when Jack reached out, he wasn't going to be hurt. That when Jack kneeled down and opened his arms, he could lean into him without fearing rejection. Most of all, Whisper learned what it meant to belong. One evening, as winter settled in, Jack sat on the couch, a book in his hands. Whisper lay nearby, his head resting against Jack's leg. The fire crackled softly. Outside, snowflakes drifted in the quiet night air. Jack ran his fingers absent-mindedly through Whisper's fur, feeling the warmth, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. A thought crossed his mind. If he had chosen another dog that day, if Whisper had never been given a second chance, he wouldn't be here. Jack exhaled, his fingers tightening ever so slightly.
"You deserve this, buddy," he murmured. "You always did."
Whisper sighed contentedly, shifting closer. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for a home. He had one.